All right, one of the key events in Jewish history is what's referred to as the Exodus, and this refers to the kind of the famous leading of the Hebrew people out of Egypt, where they had been enslaved for hundreds of years. According to Jewish Torah, God calls Moses out of the desert, sends him to Egypt to try to persuade the Pharaoh to let the Hebrew people go. And it's a long, drawn-out process. This is the event that involves all the famous plagues, the 10 plagues against the Egyptian people, the famous parting of the Red Sea, and the crossing of the Jews into the wilderness, where they wander for 40 years until they finally are allowed by God, allowed by Yahweh, to enter into the promised land, where under the leadership of the military commander Joshua, they take the land, and we see the beginning of the beginning of the state, the nation of the sacred nation of Israel, and the centrality of Jerusalem. And so this map shows a purported idea of kind of the route of the Israelites. You can see lots of question marks here. You're trying to follow the path using place names and things that are mentioned in terms of kind of treating it as a historical event, and it's a hotly debated thing, and even amongst Jews and of course later Christians too, which we'll talk about Christianity soon, which stems from Jewish tradition as well. Lots of debate about what was the Exodus? Was there an Exodus? And one of the problems with treating it as a kind of a literal historical event is that there's virtually no archaeological evidence that the Jews were ever in Egypt, and or that a mass of people that the Torah describes crossing into the Sinai wilderness, wandering there for many, many years. The idea is, archaeologically speaking, is that would have left a trace. If there were these hundreds of thousands of people that were this tribe of people that were in Egypt for hundreds of years, and then wandered in the desert for so many years, they would have left something behind. And archaeologically speaking, there's kind of almost virtually nothing. So what was it? And so it's still a puzzle. Like we noted in the last presentation, most scholars agree that the Torah itself was written down after hundreds and hundreds of years of oral history around the year 500 BCE, after the return from the Babylonian exile. So much later. And if there was an Exodus, it likely refers to a time period, a good 700 to 900 years before it was written down, 14 to 1200 BCE perhaps, but we don't really know. And so its literalness has actually become something much more important to kind of later, more kind of fundamentalist Christians than it is to kind of the Jewish people today. And that's not to say that some Jews don't think of the Exodus as a real historical event, and they think of the description in the Torah as being historical. But for the most part, my sense is that the story is most important because of its symbolism, not so much kind of its literal, kind of video cam nature or portrayal of history. But rather, what's important is that in the story we have the description of a God who works in history for the benefit of a chosen people, and sets them apart from their neighbors. The God of the Exodus is not looking out for sating his own ego, or using humanity for the betterment of himself or for other gods. This is a God that stands outside of nature. And so what the story is most important is kind of setting the Jewish people apart, and setting this deity apart from the polytheism and the many deities of the Egyptians and the other peoples of Mesopotamia and the Middle East. And that's what's important, and not so much that we see the Exodus as being kind of a literal telling of a literal historical event. But it's during that, the Torah tells that it's during that wandering in the desert, where they're for 40 years before God allows them to to enter into the promised land. This is where Moses goes up to Mount Sinai. He gets the Ten Commandments. He receives the Torah by some traditions, and it's where lots of kind of the what we call kind of the law of the Hebrew ancient Israelite people comes into place. So it's during their time in the desert that they built this tabernacle that was kind of collapsible and rebuildable as they went from place to place. But it really becomes a template for the later Temple of Solomon, which in some ways is the permanent tabernacle in Jerusalem. And I'll show you a slide very much like this that shows this very, very clearly. But all of these very specific rituals, the way of worshiping the deity, of housing the deity, the way of kind of day-to-day life, what one eats, what doesn't eat, by Torah tradition, this all comes out of this era of wandering, and this is where God starts to mark these people as being separate, and it's these laws and rituals is one of the major things that makes their culture, the people, their belief system separate. So in the tabernacle, which was kind of like a movable tent, you had kind of a first main room in which the holy candlesticks and the various tables and ritual objects were kept, and then you had a curtain, and behind that you can see here number 2, the famous Ark of the Covenant, and all of this in the Torah, all of these things are described as being commanded by God to build them in a very, very specific way. And the ark was this golden chest that they carried around with kind of poles looped through the side of it, with 2 angels, cherubim, facing each other on the top of it. And the ark represented, or in, I guess if you take it in a literal sense, for the Jewish people, it was the kind of the most potent presence of the deity, which kind of lived between the angels on the top of that ark. So wherever the ark went, the idea is the kind of the most powerful, most tangible presence of Yahweh was with them. And that tradition carries on as they settle into Jerusalem, and then hundreds of years later, when a permanent temple is built. So yes, the Ark of the Covenant, it was a golden chest in which, by tradition, the tablets of the law, the Ten Commandments, given by the deity to Moses, were kept, along with a few other ritual objects. But the kind of the most important thing was this space on the cover. Between the wings of the angels was represented the presence of the deity, and where the deity could be met in a most tangible and kind of way. So I mean, most people outside of Judaism have run into the Ark of the Covenant as a kind of this famous quest object from the Indiana Jones movie. Here you have a picture of the Ark that was built for that film. But built and according to kind of the specifications and the measurements and the descriptions, such as they appear in the Torah. So we have a good idea of what the ark would have looked like, and it's recreatable to a certain degree. But it is also one of the famous lost objects, right? And so again, the whole Indiana Jones movie centers around the discovery of the resting place, the secret resting place of this most holy of ritual objects in ancient Judaism. But in terms of real history, the ark disappears. Most scholars think that the last time we hear about it is right before the Babylonians invade and conquer Jerusalem and destroy the temple. And so what most scholars think very likely happened is that the ark was probably stolen, probably melted down or destroyed during that exile. It's at that time it disappears from history. But in the Jewish tradition, as the Jews kind of leave the wilderness and they enter into the promised land of Canaan, the land that God has promised them, the ark leads the way. The priests of this religion carry the ark before with the conquering army, and the idea is that where the ark goes, God is with them, and it's as if God is leading them and guiding them to victory in the taking of this land that he promised way back with the covenant with Abraham. So hundreds of years later, as the kingdom of Israel is established and rises in power and influence and wealth, God excuse me, requests that a temple be built for him in Jerusalem. And so it falls to King David, King David, the same guy who slays Goliath with the slingshot as a young boy, becomes the great king of Israel. It falls to his son Solomon to build this permanent temple in Jerusalem, and becomes the most holy place for Jews. And you can see, if you remember that slide just a few slides ago, the tabernacle, it very much resembles a kind of permanent tabernacle, a stone building with one room filled with the kind of the ritual objects, the candlesticks, the table of the showbread. They have the altar of incense outside, basins for purification and washing outside, and then back behind the panel, behind the curtain, you have the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant would be, and where only the high priest of the Jewish religion could go only once a year into the presence of the deity. So the kind of the most sacred place within the most sacred building for Jews. Here's a drawing of Jerusalem as it may have looked as around 63 AD CE. So a few decades after the time of Jesus. Here you see the so-called Temple Mount, on top of which Solomon's temple was built. That temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, and then it was rebuilt later and extended, and is known as Herod's temple, a later Jewish king who had a hand in decking out the new temple and adding kind of courts and decoration to it. But here's an idea of maybe what the city would have looked like under Roman rule. They got a fortified, walled city, a fairly typical city of the Middle East or the Mesopotamia of its day. But of course, the temple, the grand temple to this deity up on its Temple Mount, to one deity, still would have set them apart from the polytheistic Romans and many other peoples surrounding the Jewish lands of the day. Yeah, here's a model of what Herod's temple, the so-called Second Temple, would have looked like. So the temple was rebuilt not long after the return from Babylon, which would have been hundreds of years before Herod, but it was under King Herod that it was kind of refurbished and decked out in probably its most ornate fashion. Now that temple, the last of the Jewish temples, was destroyed in the year 70 AD CE. By the Romans. It's in that year that there's a revolt against the Romans by the Jewish people, and Titus, who would become a Roman emperor very soon, he along with his father Vespasian, they invade Palestine, Israel, Jerusalem, and they put down this this rebellion in brutal fashion. And it's during that quelling, that putting down of that rebellion, that the Second Temple was destroyed and razed to the ground, and its precious objects, gold objects, carted off and carried off. In fact, this arch that you see here, this is right in downtown ancient Rome. One of the things that the Romans would do, if you were a Roman general or a Roman emperor and you accomplished some kind of great, usually military feat, then you were allowed to perhaps raise up what they call the triumphal arch. It serves no real kind of architectural purpose. It's purely decorative. It's there to celebrate the emperor. And so following the defeat of the Jewish rebellion, Titus was allowed to put up a triumphal arch, and it still stands there right off the Roman Forum, and it commemorates this event. So it's right inside. There's some really interesting historical events commemorated on this arch. You see it, again, not through Jewish eyes, but through Roman eyes. And it's right on the inside panels as you walk through the arch. There are depictions of the spoils of this war being brought back to Rome. And so here you see one of the frieze sculptures. And so one of the things that Roman generals would do is they come back and they would parade before the Roman people prisoners of war in chains, and they would also parade objects, sacred objects that were looted from the places that they had conquered as trophies to kind of show the Roman people kind of the glory of their military victory. And here you see kind of this parade through downtown Rome, where one of the grand golden menorahs that was inside that Second Temple that was looted, carted all the way back to Rome, and is now in this parade. You can see these people holding these placards. They're blank now, but on the placards that would have been written in Latin, very likely, describing to the people watching this what exactly they were holding and what they were carrying along with them. So a little bit, and I'm leaving out a ton of stuff just for the sake of time and compactness. But if we were to kind of fast forward to modern Judaism today, most people kind of reckon like any major world religion, it's very complex when you get down to kind of who believes what and what are the divisions within them. But there are more or less kind of three major divisions in Judaism today: Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform Judaism. So I just want to say a little bit about them, just to give us a picture of what modern Judaism looks like today. Orthodox Judaism accounts for about half of Jews around the world. One of the things as Judaism develops, after the Roman, or actually before that, but after into the Roman era and beyond the Roman era, you'll hear about kind of rabbinical traditions. That is, various schools of thought, rabbis interpreting Torah, interpreting Scripture, add their thought and their breakdown of Jewish beliefs, interpreting the law. And so you have these various rabbinical traditions that are sometimes, different sects of Judaism will follow kind of one rabbi's tradition, and this one over here will follow another. Orthodox Jews, not necessarily bound to kind of one of these traditions, but they do generally subscribe to the belief that their expression of the Jewish faith is the one true one, and that's not generally true of the more kind of you might say secularized Judaism we see today. So Orthodox Jews believe that God revealed the Torah to Moses on Mount Sinai. If there is kind of a more literalist sect of Judaism, this is it. And that Torah is Torah is Torah. Torah is the most sacred of the scriptures, and in Torah you have the law revealed, in which a believing Orthodox Jew must adhere strictly to all of the rules of Torah at all times. Now this, of course, is something that's debated and discussed, and this is not to suggest that there is broad agreement about what exactly that means. But Orthodox Jews certainly believe that the way to get closer to God is the original way. You follow the law that was laid out by the God. You have things, interesting things like Orthodox Jews believe that you kind of inherit your Judaism not through the father, but through the mother, what we call matrilineal descent. You can convert to Orthodox Judaism, although it tends to be fairly rare. Orthodox Jews tend to be against interreligious marriage, that is both husband and wife should be Orthodox Jews. A mixed marriage along those lines would seem to be as a rejection of Judaism. But yes, just like any kind of large grouping, you're going to find lots of division and disagreement within the group. And so you have modern Orthodoxy versus like the Hasidic Jews that you might find in not only Israel itself, but in places like New York City, kind of ultra-Orthodox Judaism. Lots of disagreement about the roles of women in society, how integrated into kind of the larger secular society should Jews be? Should they be completely separate? Are there places where it's okay? So this is, I don't want to kind of walk away from this kind of painting this with just kind of one big broad brush. Reform Judaism is quite different, and is not so much centered on the law. It's much more about kind of acting ethically, acting morally, living in the here and now, and taking care of your own community. And so rather than say, like in Orthodox Jews, where they say that Torah was revealed on Mount Sinai and that's it, that's the starting point and the ending point for any kind of discussion about these things, Reform Jews tend to be much more loose about that. They see Judaism, it needs to evolve, change according to cultures and time as we go along. And it wasn't just one revelation on Mount Sinai, but continuous revelations continue to kind of shape and change and tweak the faith. So Jewish law, Torah, is important, but ultimately it's not binding in the way that an Orthodox Jew would find it to be. And so Reform Judaism is very much kind of invested in the here and now. And so lots of Reform Jews are involved in politics, particularly what we would call more kind of lefty, progressive politics, as a way of kind of expressing the way of kind of taking care of a community. Reform Judaism, if it has an origin point, many people point to back in the 1800s, particular Rabbi Abraham Geiger, who kind of separated from the kind of the kind of the hardcore orthodoxies of Judaism, and kind of encouraged Jews to be more kind of integrated into the larger society, kind of secularized Judaism to some degree. So it's much more kind of loose around the edges than Orthodox Judaism. So it's very pluralistic, something called Big Tent Judaism. Reform Judaism encapsulates lots of different branches of Judaic thought, very secularizing, and kind of focuses not so much about kind of religious experience for the group, but personal religious experience, and seeing a kind of religion, kind of the spiritual aspect of the faith, to be more kind of a personal and private one than a public one. So most of the Jews that you find in, say, in New York City, which is probably the city in America that has the largest Jewish population, most of the Jews in New York City, we probably would describe themselves as Reform Jews. Here you see kind of the most famous and biggest synagogue here, the Temple Emmanuel in New York City, which you'll see the interior of and described in the Heaven on Earth episode for Judaism, which I've asked you to view. So yes, this is kind of in some ways a kind of, at least in America, a kind of St. Peter's Church for Reformed Jews around the world. This particular synagogue in Manhattan. Conservative Jews. In some ways, yeah, as I have, you kind of grew out of the tension between the Orthodox and Reform movements. Jews that found themselves kind of uncomfortable with the extremes towards kind of Orthodoxy, and the more kind of extreme secularizing aspects of the Reform movements, find a kind of middle path, and so much more tied to kind of ideas of sanctity, the sacredness of holiness of Scripture, of Torah, than Reform Jews would, but also it doesn't go as far as kind of the inerrant perfect word of God that an Orthodox Jew might describe Torah with. Recognizes that for conservative Jews, Jewish law is much more binding than for Reform Jews, but allows for kind of adaptations in culture, the changing times, and that kind of Torah and law can be adapted and changed in the view of a changing culture. So lots of diversity of thought, and that's true for all of these groupings here. Makes it difficult to kind of say what exactly is the distinct theology of conservative Jews. But I've read this kind of description that conservative Judaism is marked actually by deliberate absence of theology. Its theology is that it doesn't have kind of a distinct theology, and so it has this. I think this has this in common with kind of Reform Judaism, that there's kind of an unwillingness to kind of draw lines in the sand. There's kind of an openness on the edges of this Judaism. Maybe not as much as so with Reform Judaism, but recognizing that there are many paths to God. There's a lot in Judaism that is like that leaves room for the personal experience, and recognizing that at the end of the day, God is undefinable, and to kind of put limits on God, boundaries on God, descriptions of God, is immediately to limit the deity, and that's not congruent with